My name's Allison O'Toole, as Megan mentioned. I am a freelance comics editor. I've done some comics anthologies, mostly for the Toronto Comics Press, which you may be familiar with. I worked on a few volumes of the Toronto Comics Anthology. I edited a book called Wayward Sisters that came out a few years ago. We just won the Joe Shuster Award for the Best Anthology, the Jean Day Award. We were also nominated for the Ignatz Award at SPX this year. At TCAC this year, I've got a follow-up anthology called Wayward Kindred, and I also did a smaller Frankenstein zine last year. If you're more of a mainstream comics fan, you may know the name Chip Zdarsky. I'm project managing for him right now, so we're almost finished a series called Afterlife for Comixology. I also helped him out with a book called The White Trees that came out from Image Comics last year. And I've got a few other, I worked on The Pitiful Human Lizard for Chapter House, a few of their other books, and did a little bit of work for the Disney Princess line at Joe Books. So as you can see, I've got a pretty broad range of series that I've had my fingers on over the last few years. But the first thing I want to talk about is what is an editor. I find a lot of folks online who maybe even have been in this industry for a long time don't quite understand what that role means. The main thing is that an editor is a creative collaborator for you. It's not just someone who's going to come in at the end of the comic to make sure that you put all the commas in the right place. It's someone who should be with you from the pitch all the way to the end of the book. So it's someone who can be a bit of a cheerleader for your book all the way through. So we'll do things that you'd expect an editor would do. That's your copy edits, your grammar, those kinds of things. But we'll also do edits on art. If you find an editor who can't edit your art, then you should maybe look into trying to find a different editor because we should be giving you feedback on every stage of the process. But we'll also do a lot of project management. So this is especially important in something like anthologies where you have a lot of moving pieces, but it's also important in something like a serial comic where you're going to have a lot of really tight deadlines and tight release dates. So we'll do a lot of building schedules. That's I find the main thing I spend my days doing is building schedules and then making sure that creators are following those schedules. But we're also, we can be something of a therapist. There are editors on Twitter who like to joke about that because if there's interpersonal disputes or issues between members of a creative team, it comes down to the editor to resolve those disputes. But that also can just mean, someone who's understanding of delays or any other things you have going on in your life that might be affecting your work. It's important that the editor take those things into consideration as well, and because all of that stuff ties into the ultimate success of the comic. If you've got something going on in your life that means you can't give your best work, then you can work with your editor to try to figure out a solution, to try to rejig the schedules, whatever that kind of thing takes. We'll also do things like, as I said, workflow, just making sure that people are getting things that they need in time. So that might mean making sure that the inks go to the colorist on time so that they have enough time to get it done when they need it. It can also mean things like collecting reference images, particularly if you're working for a company or like a licensed project or something like that, where you need to be sticking to character models, that kind of thing. It's the editor's responsibility to make sure that you have all of that info that you need to succeed. And there's also just little miscellaneous things that come down to the editor because someone has to do them. So that might mean collecting and sending invoices. It might mean rendering contracts, collecting those. We'll do promotional materials, so that means like rendering images for promotion. We often write the solicit text that goes in the preview catalogs of single issues. Any of those little administrative tasks that need to happen so that a comic book can come out, that's usually down to the editor. So what does an editor look for? This is a little bit more focused on scripts, and I know everyone in here would be focused on the art, but do we have folks who are interested in writing their own comics as well? Yeah, fantastic. So again, when you're submitting a pitch or a script, things like punctuation and grammar can be really important because they are they show that you can communicate clearly. If I'm getting a pitch document, whether it's for an 8-page comic or, you know, a 120-page graphic novel, I want to be sure that you are able to communicate to me in just this pitch document what you want to communicate to an audience. Because if your storytelling is already unclear and I have to decide whether I'm going to be publishing this or not, those kinds of cosmetic errors beyond a certain point can be a bit of a barrier. So that's something to keep in mind. You want to make sure that you're proofreading and editing your own pitches before they even get to the editor, who will then help you refine those things. We'll also look at things like the reader response is, I think, a good way of taking that. So there's things like anticipating your intended audience. So if you have a book that's, you know, cheery, fun, maybe for a younger audience, that you're not going to be putting anything in there that's too edgy or that might be too upsetting, that kind of thing, which also kind of comes into sensitivity readings. So if the creator wants to explore some aspect of someone else's identity that maybe isn't a part of their own identity, it's really important that the editor and the writer work together to find people to read that and give feedback and make sure that that other identities and other groups are being represented in an authentic and sensitive way. And that's just getting increasingly important in comics and in all media as we go. So that's something that your editor can help you out with. We'll also consider marketability. And I know that that's not a fun thing to think about your work as you know, a commodity, but ultimately we are in a business, and unless you're publishing a webcomic for free and you have the time and the means and the ability to do that, someone has to be making money from this, right? So the editor is often the person that has to be you know, that voice saying, okay, but how do we sell this? And so especially when you're approaching a publisher, especially one of the mainstream, the bigger publishers, that's one of the main things they're going to be looking at. And that can just be in terms of what's the hook on this, you know, what's the elevator pitch I put on Twitter to sell this book. But it's also, they have to consider things like the other lines that they have. So what other books are they publishing? And, you know, if you're pitching them a story about wrestling, for example, and they've already just picked up another wrestling comic, your idea could be great, but they've already committed to this other one. So there's all these kinds of things that editors kind of have to look at within the scope of other things that are being published at the company that may influence whether they decide to take on your comic or not. And finally, as I mentioned, editors are also looking at your art. So as you're submitting your layouts, layouts and thumbnails, for some people those are different, sometimes they're the same, but your pencils, inks, colors, all of that, we'll be looking at every single stage, and we'll be editing for, you know, the same things that your teachers are looking for. But we're also, our primary thing is making sure that your storytelling is clear, right? So sometimes that means you can like bend rules a little bit if it means you're focusing more on emotion than something like accurate anatomy. But we want to make sure always that whatever your message is, whatever your story is, that is coming through crystal clear, or as crystal clear as it can be. That should always be the editor's primary focus. The editor's loyalty is to the story above everything else. But also we'll be considering things like, are the colors you chose going to print okay? Things like that. When you hire an editor or are working for an editor at a publisher, there are a number of things that you should expect from that person and that you should hold them to, especially if this is an independent project where you are paying them. So as I've said, gone over, you know, the sort of traditional editing, storytelling, grammar, that stuff. But you also want to make sure that their schedules make sense for your workload. Ideally, an editor will have, especially if it's independent, and kind of a rough idea of how long stages take, but that can be different from person to person. So if they send you something that seems impossible for you to achieve, then you should tell them that right away. But they'll also be making sure that if you've agreed to the schedule and everything looks okay, you can expect someone, if you're late, to start sending you little gentle passive-aggressive emails if you don't submit things right away. But your editor can also be a champion for your work. Ideally, you want someone who's passionate about the story that you're trying to tell, and particularly on social media, any marketing, that they'll also be passionate and excited to tell people to buy and support your work. You want an editor who communicates efficiently. I know that seems kind of obvious, but I think we all know what it's like getting buried in a million emails. And things slip through the cracks sometimes, but editors should be really on top of emails, even if it's just a case of, hey, thanks for sending me this, I'll get back to you in a couple of days. But that's kind of a red flag. If an editor isn't communicating back with you quickly enough, everyone's busy, give them a bit of time, but if it's an ongoing problem, then that might mean someone else might be a little bit more invested in your work. If you are crowdfunding your campaign or your project, again, this in an independent day and age, that's how a lot of us are getting our work out there. I know you have another talk coming up in a few months about that. But an editor can definitely help you out with that stuff as well. Maybe not all editors have experience there, but a lot of people do, especially those of us who've done anthologies, probably have crowdfunding experience. So that's something that you can ask for support on as well. And more than anything, your editor is a problem solver. So whether they are an independent creator or supporting your independent project, whether they work for a publisher, there's someone that you should be able to come to with concerns, and then they'll figure it out for you. So that might mean, again, scheduling problems, content questions, deadline issues, any of that stuff. You should have someone that you're comfortable approaching. And I know that's not, if they've hired you, you don't always have those options about whether they're someone that you think is approachable, but you should always feel empowered to ask your editor those questions and to ask for help with problems. Because at the end of the day, if they're running the ship, then they're the one who has to solve things that might seem a little difficult. On the other side, if you are hired by an editor or you hire an editor, these are some of the things that they will expect from you. One of the main things, and this is something that I've found to be the most difficult, is getting work in on time. We are all busy, we all have a lot of commitments, especially if we're balancing a lot of different freelance projects, but we expect that you should know how to manage your own time. So if I say, hey, is 2 weeks gonna be enough time to get me layouts for this story? If you say yes, then I expect that means in 2 weeks I will see those layouts. If something comes up, if you haven't budgeted yourself enough time, if you get sick, if something urgent comes up, whatever, it's important also to just be honest and communicative about any delays or anything that might stop you. Because again, your editor is the problem solver. So if something comes up, they are the one who's gonna have to slide the schedule, particularly if you have other collaborators who might be relying on you. It's really, really important that you stay in communication about anything that might be delaying you. We'll also be sending you probably guidelines and templates if you're working for any kind of publisher that's published before. It's really, really important that you follow those. They exist for a reason. If I say I need CMYK TIFFs at 300 DPI, then that's what I need. And if you send me RGB files, you're gonna have to redo it. That kind of stuff is really, really important because, as I'm sure you all know, that's the sort of thing that can be the difference between your work looking as you want it to and looking like a muddy disaster. So it's really, really important to make sure that you follow those guidelines and those templates if they're provided to you. You also want to be open to collaboration and to implementing edits, of course. This means if someone says like, hey, the hand here looks a little wonky, you fix it, whatever. But there's also another side of that. You are a collaborator in this. You're not the hand of the artist. Despite what some comics review sites would have us believe, the writer is not the sole creative force in a comic. And that means if someone asks you for an edit that you feel would be compromising the story, that you think just doesn't quite make sense, it's your right to push back a little bit, like within reason. But you know, if someone says like, hey, change this for this reason, and you think that thematically or for whatever reason it doesn't work, you can also say, hey, this is why I did it this way, and I think it would be stronger. And if someone says that to me 70% of the time, I say, oh, okay, sure, we'll keep it. Or I'll say, here's a middle ground between what I suggested and what you suggested. So you're not expected to just take everything and take someone else's creative vision and just make their version. You're a collaborator, so it's important to understand that as well in your communication. But that said, if there's a problem that you make in one issue, let's say, a friend of mine gave me a good example, asking a creator to make sure that they put rough out speech balloons in their layouts, for example, which is something that you're asked to do on the first issue. We expect you will keep doing that. So if you're asked to correct something that's a reasonable correction, it's important to like keep that in mind and correct mistakes so that we're not asking you the same thing every single time, which can get really tedious. And other than that, I mean, just general maintaining professionalism. You know, you might have a good rapport with some collaborators where you can kind of communicate in like emojis and stuff, and that's fine. But, you know, this is a job as much as comics can be, you know, it's a fun job, but it's still a job. So it's really important. Again, if someone's sending you an email with a bunch of grammar errors and it's sloppy and it's something that should be, you know, a formal email, then that doesn't look very good. So it's important to keep that sort of thing in mind. So this is where we'll kind of transition a little bit into more of like the networking side of things, how you can get your work out there. And this is, I know I'm rushing through things and giving you a lot of info, but we will have a Q&A session after this where you can follow up on anything. But if you have any questions, let me know. The most important thing is getting your work out there. So one of the things I see a lot is folks who don't have portfolio websites, don't have anywhere that I can go and see their art, which as an editor means you're just not consideration for me at all. Whether it's like a formal portfolio site, even if it's just a blog where you upload some sequential pages, like you need to have something, because if I can't see your work, then I can't consider you for jobs. If folks are on Twitter, you'll see there are hashtags like Portfolio Day that come up periodically, Visible Women for folks who would use that hashtag. There's things like this coming up all the time. If you just follow a lot of other creators, a lot of editors, that kind of thing, those hashtags can be a really effective way to get people to notice your work. And people often ask as well for like recommendations for artists and stuff, and it can be as easy as just saying, hey, this is me, this is what I do, and that's an effective way to get your work out there. At cons, conventions, and festivals, they'll often have editors doing portfolio reviews, which can be a really useful tool. Even if they don't have anything for you right now, or they think your style could use another year or two, you're still getting your work in front of an editor, and they may have some really valuable feedback for you or a new perspective on your work that you haven't seen before. So if you're at the Toronto Comic Arts Festival, for example, it's coming up in May, there will be portfolio reviews there. If you can take advantage of those, I'd really, really recommend that you do it. Beyond that, self-publish. I know it's a pain in the butt. We don't want to do work for free. So if you can get into something like an anthology where you might get a page rate, even if it's a low one, that's a great idea. But making a small zine that you can sell at a show, or working on a webcomic or something just to be able to show what you can do with storytelling is invaluable. Again, working on anthologies, I think too many people are submitting to me and hoping to get hired as comic artists, and then only have a couple of like illustrations in their portfolio. And if I don't know what your storytelling looks like, then I can't hire you. So whether you collaborate with a friend, whether you find a script online to illustrate, you just have to do something to make sure that your sequential work specifically is available for folks to see. And finally, if you're in person especially, it's really essential that you know how to talk about your work. Everyone, I think in comics particularly, there's a culture right now of kind of self-deprecation. We all like to go on and talk about like, I got no sleep, or like, here's something stupid I did today, because it feels relatable. And that can be fun and fine. But I think that I've started to see that self-deprecation start to extend to people talking about their work. And if I meet you in a bar or at a launch party or at a convention, and I say, oh, hi, what do you like to do? And you're like, oh, well, I'm not working on anything right now, and I don't know, I like to draw stuff. that doesn't tell me anything about you, and it's not going to, you're not going to stay in my mind, and chances are you might not stay in other people's minds. So it's really important to have an idea of if your identity as an artist is, I want to draw anything, you might want to sit down with yourself and think, what do I want to draw? What genres do I want to draw? Do you like to draw robots? Do you like, whatever it is, do you like to draw people kissing? Do you like to draw backgrounds? Like, whatever it is, just have something that you're passionate about and that's unique to you. Because as you'll see is a bit of a theme here, you're selling yourself, and if you are confident in the things that you're passionate about, people who are passionate about those same things will find you, and that's how collaboration happens. Online specifically, do most folks in here have at least Instagram or Twitter already, I hope? Yeah. If you don't, I'd really strongly recommend that you get both. It seems like Instagram isn't the easiest platform to find new audiences on, but as an editor, I often use it to look at people's most recent work. So you can have a finished page in your portfolio that's from 2 or 3 years ago, maybe. You haven't had time to, do a full story since then, but at least figures and sketches and that kind of thing, I can use your Instagram to get an idea of what your art looks like right now. So even if it's not something that you're building a huge follower base, even if it's something that you just post on, once a week or something that's there as a sort of additional portfolio piece, it's really valuable. But Twitter is still, I think, the best one for being able to network and communicate and find new people who are passionate about the same things that you are. So I really recommend it. I know it doesn't come naturally to everyone, but I would recommend getting on there. One of the big things, as I mentioned, is you don't want to be overly negative, particularly about yourself, but also about the industry. It's one thing, obviously, if you have legitimate criticisms about something like representation of your identity or of marginalized groups, that kind of thing, but you don't want to get on there and start shit-talking your editors or publishers or anything like that. It just isn't really a good look. And people don't, they might respond with clicks, but they're not going to respond with, oh, I want to work with that person, if all you do is come down on yourself and other people and on the industry. So as much as possible, I would say try to focus on the positives, just because I think that makes you seem like a more appealing collaborator, and by focusing on your passions, you're showing people what you care about, which can often be reflected in your work. It's also important to be friendly, which is sort of part of the other thing, but you see a lot of folks who think like, hey, I'm just gonna tweet at Scott Snyder and Chip Zdarsky and all these people who are really famous and they'll wanna work with me, which is not how that works. It's important to just be genuine and make friends with your peers. I know Jim Zub, who's a Marvel writer who also teaches at Sheridan, that's his big thing, is you have to make friends with your peers who are coming up with you now, because they are the people who you're most likely to collaborate with at this point, but it also means you can bring each other up. If you have a buddy that's in the same position that you are, maybe they're an artist, you're an artist, they get a job at a particular company, they can probably get your foot in the door at that company, or a writer approaches them with something that they don't have time for, or doesn't fit, or it's not the right style for them, whatever, they can maybe recommend you for that. So it's really important to try to find other people who are also sort of starting out in their careers, because those are the people that you may find the most fruitful collaborations with now and further down the road. This is another one that seems intuitive, but people make this mistake all the time. Make yourself easy to contact. Put your email on your Twitter page, put it on your website, put it everywhere. If I Google your name, I want to be able to find how I can contact you, because if I can't, I won't, and I will contact someone else. So make sure that that's easy to find. Oh, you know what, another thing too is to understand when it's important to be professional and when you should be a little bit more casual. I kind of mentioned this with emails, but